We're going to look at this question tonight, which is, the Israelites were forbidden to have graven images in the Old Testament. Does this mean it is wrong to have pictures of Jesus? And so, as I was just mentioning, this kind of goes along with what we were talking about in the previous questions about the Old Testament. And, here we had questions about the Old Testament. Now we kind of got a question about how we're going to take the Old Testament and kind of apply it to something going on now. So, in the Old Testament, they did have some very strict orders commands to not have any sort of idols. And we can find that in the Ten Commandments. And so, let's turn over to the book of Exodus, chapter 19. And let's just take a look at two of the Ten Commandments, all right? Well, chapter 20 is really where the Ten Commandments are. But going back to chapter 19, you recall that they came to Mount Sinai. Moses went up to top of Mount Sinai, and God told him that of all peoples of the world, God had selected the Israelites to be his chosen people. And he was going to have a covenant with the Israelites. And he came down and told them that. And they said that everything the Lord says we will do. And so there's this original agreement of God saying, okay, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people if you do what I say. And the people are saying, yes, we are going to do exactly what you say. And so Moses goes back up and then gives Moses instructions for the people to consecrate themselves because the next day this was all going to take place. And in chapter 19, starting in verse number 14, it says, after Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them and they washed their clothes. He said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day, abstain from sexual relations. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Can you imagine being there and seeing that sight? That would just be, in the strict literal sense, awesome. Awesome. Full of awe. I mean, it would just be mind-boggling to see this. Okay? And so if you get that picture in your mind of what's going on, now we come down to chapter 20 and verse number 1. Because when we talk about the Ten Commandments, when we think about the Ten Commandments, what do we think about? We think about the 2 stone tablets, don't we? But we neglect to think that before God gave Moses those 2 stone tablets, God spoke the words to the Israelites. And so that's actually what we find in chapter 20. It says, and God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Here's commandment number 1. You shall have no other gods before me. Here's commandment number 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to those who love me, and keep to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay, so we got commandment number 1, and that is that you don't need to have any other gods before me. Commandment number 2 is that you shall not make any idols. Okay? Now, when you look at this, do you see some similarities and do you see some differences? Because when you think about it, you can kind of look at it and you say, well, commandment number 1 and commandment number 2 is a little bit superfluous, isn't it? And that is, you don't have any other gods, and then the gods that you're thinking about is you're thinking about idols, and so you don't have any idols, right? Okay. But I think that we need to kind of understand a little bit of the differences and try to separate it. And that is when we stop to think, okay, well, wait a minute, what is an idol? An idol is going to be a representation, a physical representation of a higher supposed spiritual power. Right?
Yes.
Okay. And so, yeah, you got a little idol, which is going to be, like a little statue or maybe even a big statue or whatever. But that is going to be a representation of a God that is supposedly out there. So you've got this might, you've got this power that's out there, and then you've got this God, this idol that is there that is going to be a representative of that. And so in worshiping the idol, then what you do is you wind up worshiping the God. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So when you kind of understand that, you see a little bit more about what he's talking about. So that is, first of all, in the first commandment, you don't need to have any other gods before me. Because God is what he says here. He's a jealous God in the second commandment. And so he is a jealous God, meaning that he does not want anybody to worship any other thing than him. And some people will say, well, wait a minute, isn't it wrong to be jealous? No, it's not wrong to be jealous. If you have a legitimate right to be jealous over something, okay? For example, if you're jealous of something that you really don't have any cause to be jealous about, then you're unjust in your jealousy. But at the same time, if you have a spouse that is cheating on you and you have feelings of jealousy over that, well, you have a right to have that, right? Because, husband and wife, they've made a commitment to God, before God, that they're going to love each other. And so when you think about it like that, jealousy itself is not necessarily the wrong thing. It is if it is based on the wrong thing. So God being jealous, why would God be jealous over other gods? Because there's no other gods, right? I mean, you got the God, he was created the heavens and the earth. He is the only one who is due worship and glory and honor and praise, because he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And since he's the creator of everything, then somebody, by worshiping a false god, is actually taking a part of his creation and trying to accredit glory and honor and worship where it doesn't need to be credited. So going back to this day and time, you would have the false god of Baal. Okay? And so Baal was a storm god. So they would be looking at the storms that would be going around, and they would say, this storm is great, mighty, and awesome, and powerful, and we don't understand it. It's just that we fear it because of what it could do to us. So therefore, if we worship this power or this God, then maybe this God's going to leave us alone. Okay? All right. And since it is hard for us to wrap our head around this, intangible force, we're going to make it something that's tangible in the form of an idol. So you see how the two can connect. Okay? And so as far as idols go, you don't need the idol, but you also don't need the worshiping of the God that the idol is going to be represented as well. Okay? All right. So think about that for a second. And now let's go on over to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. So in Deuteronomy chapter 4, in verse number 15, we see a little bit more about some of the things that are going to be forbidden as far as idolatry goes. So in Deuteronomy chapter 4, and in verse number 15, you notice that it says, you saw no form of any kind on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb, or Sinai, out of the fire. Okay, so that's why I wanted to read that back in chapter 19. So when you go back to Exodus chapter 19, and we've read that, God was there on the mountain, but did you see God? You didn't. How was God described? God came down as fire, and then the fire was on top of the mountain, wasn't it? God spoke, and his voice was as a trumpet that was growing louder and louder and louder. But as far as God goes, you can't say, oh, I saw God. Well, you saw what God was representing himself to for the Israelites, but you did not see God himself. Right? Okay, so here's Moses, and then Moses is giving the second law to that other generation of Israelites. He's reminding them, because, some of these kids, some of them may be little kids that were there, okay? Because, anybody who was a certain age and up wasn't going into the promised land, a certain age and down. So there could have been some people that were there, where Moses was talking to them, where they would have remembered seeing it, where he says, "You saw no form of any kind on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb or Sinai out of the fire." And so he's just reminded them, you have not seen God. Even when God met with you to establish that covenant, you have not seen God. So, verse number 16, back to verse number 15, therefore, watch yourselves very carefully so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, with form like a man or a woman, or like an animal on earth, or bird that flies in the air, or any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. When you look up at the sky and see the sun, the moon, the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping the things the Lord your God has appointed to you, to all the nations under heaven. Apportioned to you all the nations under heaven. But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the iron smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance, as you now are. Okay, so when you look at this, what you see is that starting out, he's saying that, because you've never seen any God, any form of God, be sure that you don't make any idols. Don't make any forms to yourself. It doesn't matter if it's man, woman, it doesn't matter if it's an animal, land, air, or sea creature. It doesn't matter if it's the sun, moon, and the stars. Just don't make any idols. Okay? Now, stop and think about this. Why would God say, if you didn't see any form, don't make any idols?
You don't know what I look like, so don't try to guess.
You don't know what I look like. Don't try to guess. Right? Okay? Because whatever you come up with, it's going to be wrong. And whatever you come up with, what could end up happening is you could become corrupted, or you could become enticed into thinking that object has some sort of representation of God when it has no representation of God. It seems kind of interesting to me, as far as the sense goes, that one thing that's so very hard for people of all generations, all ages, all whatever, is to just simply get to the point of understanding, knowing, and living by faith. When you live by faith, can you see it? No, because we walk by faith and not by sight. So if you can't see God, how are you going to know God? Through faith. And faith is not something that you can see the object of. You just have the evidence of the things hoped for, right? Okay, so going back to this idea about idols, you can see that somebody's going to say, okay, well, yes, I am making an idol, but this is not an idol to Baal. This is not an idol to Ashtoreth or Shemosh or Molech or any of the other gods or goddesses of the land of Canaan. This is to the Lord. This is to God, the Lord God Almighty, who's created the heavens and the earth. I just do this as a way for me to kind of keep a reference point. I do this to kind of pin me down to me, to remind me of who God is. See, the Israelites couldn't do that. But the reason why they couldn't do that is because of this right here. These commandments. You don't make idols. You don't make idols because the Lord your God is very, very much good. Okay? All right. So,
can I comment?
Yeah.
What I think would be interesting is the idea that if they're making this idol to God, to the true and living God, the people who make idols to all their other gods could turn right around on them and say, well, you're doing the exact same thing we are, how are you any different?
Right. And they wouldn't be. It would be the same thing, right?
There's like a separation. being odd.
Well, it is, and beyond that, what's going to be the oddity is that just the idea of faith. You know, we have a relationship with the Lord God by faith. We don't have a relationship with the Lord God by physical means. We have it by faith. And even the tabernacle, and like the Ark of the Covenant and everything, was not to be used that way. And when the Israelites went and took the Ark of the Covenant and started to misuse it in taking it into battle, and the Philistines said, "Oh no, we're doomed. A God has come into the Israelites' camp." I mean, that's the way that they were viewing it. Guess what? They lost. And the Ark of the Covenant was captured. And they were sorely defeated. But you remember the story goes that the Ark of the Covenant then went and the Lord knocked over Dagon, their God, and the Philistines eventually had returned it to the Israelites because they didn't want it anymore. It was making them sick. Okay? Well, I guess that's another question at all. Okay, so get back to this. Getting back to the question, and that is the question is, the Israelites were forbidden to have graven images in the Old Testament. Does it mean it's wrong for us to have pictures of Jesus? Okay, so here we've got the Old Testament, right? And we've got a commandment in the Old Testament, and so this kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the last couple of questions. You know, since Jesus fulfilled the law of the Old Testament, that means that we're not under the principles or we're not under the commandments of the law, right? But at the same time, we need to understand that there are moral principles, righteous principles that are at play that are still valid and still very much there. I mean, yes, we are not under the principle or the commandments to go and do the religious ceremonies and things like that, because that pointed to Jesus. Jesus fulfilled it. There's really no need for it. But at the same time, like for example in the Ten Commandments, because Jesus fulfilled the law, does that mean that we can murder? Does that mean that it's okay to steal? Does that mean that it's okay to covet? No, it is not, is it? And so there's principles at play that's there. So here we take a look at these commandments, and that is you don't have any of God's, and you don't have graven images. The reason why you don't have graven images is because you really don't know what God looks like, and when you start to imagine what God looks like, you can be lured and enticed into thinking that this has some sort of power and some sort of thing that we worship. Okay? So now, let's talk about Jesus and pictures of Jesus. Okay? So here's the Old Testament. Let's talk about the application of it. Do we know what Jesus looked like? We don't know what Jesus looked like. Okay?
Doesn't he look like an Italian with long hair and a beard?
Well, that was one picture that I saw of him that is very there in my, from when I was a boy. Okay? All right. Yeah, we don't know what Jesus looked like. Okay? So here we are trying to make a representation. And I think many times we do it, sometimes very innocently. You know, I'm not going to, somebody has a picture of Jesus, I'm not going to come and say, you idolatry. But at the same time, I'm going to say, hey, wait a minute, should we really be doing this? Because it could start to lead people into some sort of form of idolatry. I'm not saying that each and every person who has a picture of Jesus thinks this way or feels this way, but I do know that sometimes people will want to have a picture of Jesus in their house because they think it's going to bring them safety, or it's going to bring them peace, or it's going to bring them whatever. But wait a minute. Jesus is there. You don't have to have a picture of him. You can't see him, but that's where the walking by faith comes in, right? And just because you can't see him, it doesn't mean he isn't there, and it doesn't mean that he isn't there to help you, provide for you, and everything like that. And I don't know, to me, from what I read here in Deuteronomy, if somebody came in and said, hey, I want to put a picture of Jesus in the church, I'm going to say, you know what? I think I've got a problem with that, because we don't need to have anything that's going to be a representation, a misrepresentation of Jesus, because we've got everything that we have right now. Okay? All right. I'm sure you're loaded with questions and comments about this one.
I was gonna say, if you want to imagine what God looks like, go read Revelation, like what is it, 4,
Mm-hmm.
where he describes God. You'll stop. You won't want to imagine it anymore. This is scary.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know that it's meant to be scary. It just,
Intimidating.
fearful. Yeah. A righteous fear. Righteous fear. And
I read that this
incidentally,
week. That's what.
the Old Testament tabernacle was really to be a pattern of what is, in heaven right now. And in all the designs of what God gave Moses to build the tabernacle with, you don't see images and representations of God. You do see them saying, make cherubim, on the curtains of the ceiling, make cherubim that's there above the Ark of the Covenant. And by the way, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat was really what was on the Ark of the Covenant. That's where God dwelt. So you didn't need to have a representation. Okay, other comments and questions?
You think of all these different things, but like the Catholics have the cross with the representation of Jesus hanging on it. Where did that come from? I mean, because don't most Catholics keep that in their house or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to call the Pope and ask him. I don't know where that came from.
And then I've been working my way through the Bible again and talking about the different, where they'll stack up rocks for altar to honor God or sacrifice to God.
Yeah.
So that's different than an idol.
Very much. Because it's not.
Because
it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And the Israelites were not supposed to cut their stones like the Canaanites did. They were supposed to have them just, altar rocks and just stack the rocks up in the altar.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Just like don't mess with what God made. That's my first thought.
I really don't know exactly the reason for it. It's just that, if you think about taking, stones and then dressing them and then, creating something, that you are creating something that is therefore going to worship God. So that can very easily start to become an idol, can it?
What about the cross? People, I think of that woman that you had one time that came in and said, do you guys have a cross in your building?
Right.
Because I only want to go to a church that has a cross in their building.
Right, yeah. When you think about it, there's a lot of things can become idols about, just period. As a matter of fact, when you look at the Bible, money can be an idol. Greed can be an idol. In fact, it is. And as far as a cross, if you want to, wear a cross as a decoration to say this is, a way for me to say I am a Christian, fine, But if somebody comes up and says, I want to wear this cross because, I want to have God's protection in my life, no, wait a minute. You don't need to go there. You don't need to do that, right? Because God's going to protect you by His power. He doesn't need some sort of little symbol there to back it up. And by the way, that, kind of going back to when we had our discussion on the tombstone and everything, this is the reason why I don't think that God has left all of these things in place. People say, where's the Ark of the Covenant? Where is Calvary's cross? Where is the tomb? Where is the... Well, I think that God, in His wisdom, has kind of let those things slide down through the ages of history, and vanished, because if we did have those things, then people would be worshiping them.
And they could be money makers.
Oh, yeah. And there goes the greed that's in idolatry too. Okay.